Tonight we have Ben Strauss. Those of you who have been listening in, Ben grew up here in Colorado, grew up in Loveland, went to CSU. So I'm kowtowing to him with the CSU hat tonight. But he has his master's in mechanical engineering. Yes. Yep. And he's working in the aerospace industry. But he fell in love with photography about 5 years ago after being an avid, backpacker, mountain biker, loving being outdoors, and got to the point where he loved the whole contemplative approach to observing nature and the subtle changes in light and so forth. But as I was talking about earlier, Ben has a very artistic, stylistic approach to his processing that I've really enjoyed, since I've been following him online the last year or so. And, he's going to do us a quick run through tonight on Lightroom through to Photoshop and how he approaches this. If you have questions, you can type them into the group chat. I will try and monitor them. He doesn't mind if we chime in, but so long as we're not just like peppering and, we can't get through the program. So if that becomes too many questions, being rapid fire, we may just have to wait till the end. But that being said, I will turn it over to Ben and let him begin his program.
All right, thanks, Shawn. So my camera is over here, but my photography monitor is over here, so forgive me for not looking at the actual lens of the camera for most of the time. And so before I jump in, I did want to go through some examples of my work, just some before and after, so you can get an idea of what Shawn was talking about. Let me share my screen here first. All right. So I fell in love with the painterly, cinematic, fantastical, kind of dreamy look of a photograph in landscape. I mean, a lot of it's kind of derived from cinematic movies and the color grading they do in Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and stuff like that you would see. So just some examples. These are some befores and then afters after I take it through my process. So the difference between the before and after can be quite drastic, but it's not always. This is from last weekend up at Blue Lakes. This is the before, and then there's an after. An example of a little more mild approach to editing this photograph. Some befores and an after. This is an example of a photograph you can take quite a long ways, make it from nothing into something. So this is a before into an after, just to show the power of painting with light. And that's dodging and burning, really. And it's super powerful and a very useful technique that we'll talk about. And then finally, one last before and then after. This one's showing a little bit of light bleeding, some color tone adjustments and color grading, and then some long exposure blending into the foreground. So there's some quick examples before we jump in. So today we're going to look at a photograph that I took at Crested Butte during the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival. I don't know how many of you have gone to that, but it's quite worth the time and the money to go up there. It's kind of a photography-based festival for a week, and it's a lot of fun. And I had the honor of being one of the photographer guests, and I got to teach classes up there. So this is from Gothic Valley. And I'm going to choose this copy here really quick that I did a few brief adjustments to, just so we can see what we're working with. The others are completely raw, unedited. So this is a pretty large depth of field. We have a nice meandering river through the scene, a couple cabins, and this is during sunrise. So we had the sun rising right up behind this mountain, and the sky is getting quite excited with color in this image, which is always what we hope for as photographers during sunrise or a sunset. So in this image, when I'm doing something like this, the first thing I think, because it is a large depth of field, is I want to focus stack. And if you haven't heard of focus stacking, it's the process of taking an image, multiple images, different focal lengths throughout the image, or excuse me, not focal lengths, but focal points throughout the image. So we get the foreground in focus, the midground in focus, the background in focus, and then pretty much focus to infinity. And then we can blend those images together so the entire image from front to back is in focus. And the nice thing about this technique is you can't obtain this kind of depth of field, full focus without stacking multiple images together. It's just not possible with current lens technology, or really just optical physics in general, kind of limit us on how much we can get in focus. So we're gonna start, we have these three here, and the way that I like to organize my focus stacking, you'll see I have a 1 star, a 2 star, and a 3 star. That's kind of how I mark what's my foreground, midground, background focus exposures. And then I have some exposure blending as well, where I reduced or increased my shutter speed so that I could avoid clipping my highlights. So this is going to be a combination of an exposure blend and a focus stack. So in the end, we'll really have 5 or 6 images merged into one. And that's what we're going to get started with here. So before, just so I don't get confused, I'm going to delete this virtual copy. That way I don't accidentally edit on that one. So when I have multiple images like this and I'm doing a focus stack, I want all of the adjustments to be applied to every image identically. And I'll usually pick my middle ground so I can kind of see a good idea. The foreground's a little fuzzy, the background's a little fuzzy, but most of the image is in focus. And I'm going to do my basic adjustments on this. So from a high level, I do most of my basic, really quick adjustments, bring my raw images to something that's workable level where I can see everything, and my highlights and my shadows are as unclipped as possible before I take it into Photoshop, where I do my heavy editing and my focus stacking and my exposure blending and my dodge and burning and various other techniques. But Lightroom is great for cataloging. It's got a great cataloging system, and I like to use it up front to get the basic adjustments out of the way. So for this one, right off the bat, I mean, looking at the histogram, we're getting pretty close to clipping our shadows, and we're definitely clipping our highlights, which is why I grabbed and snagged these lower exposures when I was out there in the field. If you have to choose, though, always veer towards clipping your shadows and save your highlights. It's less obvious. You can have blacked out shadows and you can fade them with tone curves later. But if you clip your highlights, it's quite obvious and there's no real way to recover from it. So if you do want to take one exposure, always try to squeeze your highlights in, and don't worry so much about the shadows. But in this case, I took multiple exposures so we can blend those in later. So I'm first going to just do some quick adjustments, raising my shadows up. Not too much, but I do want to get this nice, this is a bimodal, almost a trimodal histogram here, where you can see 2 humps where we have a lot of shadows, pretty flat midgrounds, and then we start to get some highlights. So I'm going to just curve out my shadows by bringing this up, and I do most of this visually. I do like to pay attention to the histogram, but a lot of it's intuitive. And no matter how many photos I edit or re-edit, every time I approach a photo, it turns out slightly different. I don't really have a cookie cutter process to it, so a lot of it is intuitive. And so we're going to drop our highlights, and the reason why I'm doing this, I am going to swap the sky out with the lower exposure or the darker exposure, but I want to drop my highlights so that they expose better together, so my river doesn't look overly bright when I swap in that darker exposure sky. And the same with the flowers and just some of the reflected light on the foreground. So I am going to drop my highlights just to make the sky look a little bit more natural. Therefore, all the reflected ambient light in the foreground will also better blend to the sky later. Let's see, for this one, there's really not a lot I want to do with temperature, although I usually try to keep things a little cooler up front because I do like to add a lot of warm light later on during our dodging and burning. And then tint, I think I'm going to leave as is. And this is so different from photo to photo. So sometimes the scene just looks super magenta or it looks super green, and then I'll adjust these. I mean, one quick tip that I do use, if you have blue in your sky, I like to adjust my tint such that my blue matches a perfect royal blue. So it's not too teal and it's not too blurple or blue purple, as a lot of people call it. So I'll use the blue colors to kind of guide where I'm going to go with tint. So that's a good, just like a rule of thumb or a nice little trick. With this one, texture, I'm not going to really mess with this stuff. Clarity and texture, I'm going to do localized adjustments in Photoshop. I'm going to add a lot of texture and clarity to the foreground and the flowers and the river and some of this longer exposure water. So I'm not going to worry too much about this. Like I said, Lightroom's all for high level, quick, basic adjustments to get the image to a workable state. So like a new base layer. So the next thing I always jump to in Lightroom, because I like its sharpening algorithms are a lot better, I think, versus Photoshop. Despite both being made by Adobe, I think Lightroom handles it better. Plus, you're doing the sharpening on a raw file, so you have that pixel information there versus doing it on a TIFF or a PSD later. So default is 40, unless you go in deep into your settings and change it. I always like to push it to about double my megapixels resolution on my camera sensor. So I shoot with a Mark IV 5D, which is about, I think it's about a 36 megapixels. So I'll push it about double. And my sweet spot is about 65. And this is both from the community and learning from others, this rule of thumb, and just from trial and error, just to see how much can I push this clarity without introducing too much noise into the sky and into shadows. So sometimes I push the sharpness even further. So what I'll do, let's do 65 here. And then we are going to get some inherent noise in the photograph despite shooting this one at ISO 100. But it's really not that bad. If I do have a bit of noise after I hit the sharpening, I'll go down to the noise reduction and bump it up to no more than 20. So they kind of work together to add clarity but also reduce the noise, as opposed to if you just do one of them, then you're going to either soften your image too much or you're going to get too much noise if you just do the sharpening. This color slider is often overlooked by a lot of photographers. It's really useful, especially for Milky Way photography. If you're shooting in really dark conditions and you boost your shadows, you know how you can get that really pink and purple hot pixels. I mean, it just adds a lot of these weird colors to your dark shadows after you raise your exposure. Dragging this color slider all the way up to, you can go all the way to 100. It doesn't affect the actual colors in your image, but it'll get rid of all that colorful noise that you see in the pixels in really dark areas of your photograph. So I almost always just hit this to at least 80 because it doesn't hurt, but it definitely cleans up some of that purple green stuff you get in your shadows when you're increasing your exposure in those areas. So it's a very underused tool, but it's very useful and very powerful. Next, I'm going to go to lens correction and turn on chromatic aberration. So always do this. Even the most expensive lenses on the Hubble telescope have chromatic aberration. So when NASA gets their images back, they use a very similar algorithm to remove that green and purple you get when your lens separates the white light. You get some of that aberration around really contrasting edges, and I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm talking about. So it's always good to turn this on early on. You can also do this enable profile corrections. It kind of removes some of the distortion you get from your lenses. So for example, if I turn this on, it knows I shot with a 24-70 EF Canon lens. It'll remove some of the vignetting and then kind of correct for some of the distortion. But I like the vignetting. I always add it back later. So why remove it now if I'm going to put it back later? So I don't really bug with the profile corrections. But that is what it does if you wanted to mess around with it. And then other than this, we're going to do some Orton blurs, or Orton Blur singular later, which adds color to the image. But if you aren't going to use that technique and your image looks a little bit desaturated, you do have your vibrancy and your saturation sliders. The problem with these is they're very targeted. So for example, if I kind of exaggerate here, if if I'm dragging my vibrance up, which targets lesser saturated pixels, if you get too far, it starts to bin the colors. And by bin, I mean separate them. So you can really see where the orange stops and where the purple starts in the sky. And saturation does this, I mean, even to a more exaggerated level, because it's kind of a global saturation adjustment. Another underused tool is calibration. You can also target your colors like this, but it splits it into your primaries, red, green, and blue. So any color that has blue in it at all, any hint of it, it's going to increase that saturation, but it does it in such a way to where you don't start to separate your colors when you get too far. So you can see as I drag this up, everything does increase in saturation, but it doesn't do it in such a way where you get this color banding or this disgusting kind of oversaturated look. So I always highly recommend doing your color saturation increases using this calibration tool. You can, if you wanted to, you can also change the hues, but I don't really want to do that because it drastically changes the color profile of your photo. But blue primary does the best overall. If you just want to target the sky, you can do red primaries, and similarly, you can do just the greens to target the greens. But if you want an overall, blue does a really nice way of increasing your color without banding your color. But we're going to do that later in Photoshop because I don't want to oversaturate now because we are going to do some tonal contrast adjustments. And the more contrast work you do, the more saturated your photo gets. It's just kind of a byproduct of doing contrast work. So that's pretty much all I'm going to do. If I wouldn't have gone through explanations, it would have taken me about 15 seconds to probably adjust this photograph, maybe 30 seconds. So once I have this photograph adjusted, I'm going to select the other two, the 1, 2, 3, the other two exposures that are part of the focus blend. And I'm going to go down to synchronize and synchronize all the properties so that they all look identical. So when we go to blend it, we don't have any discrepancies with the color or the exposure or the sharpness. And then finally, we have our dark exposure and then our even darker exposure. So I always take one extra dark exposure just in case. You never want to, it's the worst thing is when you get back to your computer and you realize you clipped your highlights even though you thought you didn't. So it doesn't hurt to take one exposure darker than you'd ever think you'd have to go just to play it safe. In this case, looking at the histogram, we're pretty close to clipping our highlights, but we're actually not. So I might just use this one stop darker exposure. A fun little trick to check if you are clipping your highlights is to hold Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac. So hold that key down and then click on your highlight slider, and you'll see if I drag highlights up, anything that starts to show color in yellow or reds, it's showing you what colors you're clipping. And then as it turns into white, that means you're clipping all the colors on that histogram. So if I keep it right at neutral as best as I can, you'll see that we're not really clipping any colors, or sorry, any highlights. So I'm not gonna worry about using this darker exposure because we're all good here. So with this one, I'm gonna knock down my highlights a little bit so we can get that nice blue sky poking through here, but not too much. And then I'm gonna boost my shadows up all the way because we're not gonna use the foreground in this exposure, but just like the same way that I knocked down my highlights on my focus stack exposure, I'm going to do the shadows on this one so that when we do blend them together, they're seamless, or as seamless as we can make them. So now if you jump from my midground to my exposure blend frame, you'll see that they're pretty similar as far as highlights and shadows go. So we're not going to have this crazy contrast between our sky and our foreground. So I think that's about good. I am going to knock it down a little more. And then I'm going to do the detail work on this as well. So we've got 65 here. Let's bring my colors up and then just turn on chromatic aberration. Oop, that's the wrong one. There we go. All right, now that I've done all that I'm going to use. I'm going to remove this dark one so that I don't accidentally use it. And now I'm going to crop my image the way that I want it to be cropped. So we don't need this much sky. There's a lot of negative space in there after the colors kind of dissipate out. So I want to get my flowers and my stems down here. They're really nice, and I'm probably going to end right where this color starts to fade off. So somewhere right there looks good. And then I'm going to highlight all my images once more, synchronize, uncheck, because I don't want to put all the settings that I did on these focus stacks onto the exposure blend. They do have different settings. And I'm just going to select crop. So now it's only going to synchronize the crop across all of these images. And when you see that image moving a little bit when I move from focus to focus, that's called focus breathing. If you have a really, really high-end expensive lens, some of the lenses don't focus breathe, but most lenses, in my experience, when you do different focal points, they shift a little bit and the image will kind of get smaller and it'll pull out as you focus closer and closer to the lens. So that is called focus breathing. Luckily, Photoshop is pretty good at dealing with that. So now that we've got everything the way we want it in Lightroom, I'm going to select all of the images that are involved in the focus stack. So these three. I'm going to right click it, and then I'm going to go to edit in, and then we have all these options. I'm going to drop down here to open as layers in Photoshop. The reason why I'm not opening them as smart objects, which keeps them in their raw file format, is you can't do things like auto aligned and focus stack exposure blends when the image is as a smart object. So you have to keep them in this rasterized format is what they call it. So let me, sometimes when I start doing these screen shares, Photoshop likes to get a little bit laggy on me. Okay, there we go. So I've got my 3 exposures, and you'll see them down here on the bottom right. What I'll usually do for a class is name these so that we kind of keep track of which is what. Sorry, I have my caps on here. So I'm going to do foreground there. This one's going to be my middle ground image. So we'll call this middle. And then finally, we have our background. So we'll just call this back. So what I'm going to first do, because we have that focus breathing here, is highlight all the images, go up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And then there's all these different projections. I always do auto. Photoshop's usually better at deciding than I am. And I'm not going to remove the vignette because I'm going to add it later, and the same with the geometric distortion. I'm going to keep that. So I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to go through, and it's making sure all the images are aligned, and it does that by slightly distorting the images and changing their size. So now you can see that I've done all these, that the images are quite aligned and they don't really shift as much. So the next step is to highlight all the images, and we're going to do our focus blend. So Photoshop also has an algorithm for this. It's called Auto Blend Layers. Now that our images are aligned, we're going to stack images. I always check seamless tones and colors. So if we do have a difference in exposure, which I noticed my foreground is a little bit brighter, it's going to do what it can to adjust for that. And I'm not going to do content aware filled transparent areas. So around the edges, you might get some empty layers, but we can just crop that out later. So right now it's blending the exposures together. And so it's finished. And you'll see if I zoom in from front to back, my flowers are in focus, my midground, my river's in focus, and my background, my mountains are in focus. So the entire image, what it did is it went through those 3 images and selected the most in focus pixels of each image, and then created these masks over here that it put on each layer so that it would only show through those pixels that are in focus. And that's kind of how the algorithm works. And we can see the different the different masks. There's our back. Here's our middle, where it shows what's right behind the flowers. And then here's our foreground, where it shows the flowers and anything else that it deemed most in focus. So next thing we're going to do, we've got our nice front to back in focused image. I'm going to highlight all of these, right click them, and I'm going to merge them into one layer. That just saves space so that our file's not as big. So we still have our entirely focused image, but instead of having 3 individual images, now we have one TIFF. So I like to save my files as TIFF. You can do the PSDs. I think they allow you to save up to 10 gigabyte files. The TIFFs max out at 2.5 gigabytes before you throws you an error and says that it's too big to save. But I kind of edit destructively, so you have your indestructive and your destructive editing styles. I always tend to smash my layers together. You kind of have to be confident in the fact that you don't want to ever go back and make adjustments early on that you made, because once you smash them together, it kind of bakes them all into one image. But I do that to save space, and I'm really careful as I edit and I go along that I try to make sure I don't ever want to double back on any decisions that I made. So that's why I merged them all together. It definitely decreases the file size. So the next thing I'm going to do is go back to Lightroom, and I'm going to grab my darker exposure now that I have my fully focused image. I'm going to go to Edit, Edit in Adobe Photoshop. Give it a second to bring it on over. So it opens it up in a different tab, which is fine. I'm going to go to, well, there's a couple ways to do this. The way that I like to do it is just select the image, Control Copy, go to the image with the focus stack on it, and then just Control V, and now I have both images in the same tab. And then I can go ahead to this one and close it. I don't need to save it since I have it over here. So I'm going to highlight them both. You'll notice that they're not actually quite aligned because I did the alignment on the focused one, so this one was not part of it. So I'm going to do the same thing. Sorry, excuse me. I've got these. I'll explain this in a second here, what's going on over here. So I'm going to highlight them both, go up to Edit, and go to Auto Align Layers, Projection Auto, and hit OK, and it's going to do the same thing to align these layers. So now you see nice and aligned. You'll see that it kind of distorted the sky up here to get that to happen. We can always crop that out later. So now we've got our focused image and we have our sky. So now we have to blend in exposure blend, but in this case, I'm really just gonna sky swap from the dark exposure to the brighter exposure, or the focused foreground, midground, background. So the way I'm gonna do this is select, doesn't really matter which image, have one of the images highlighted. I'm going to hit the W key, which is a hotkey for this quick select tool. So you can also go up here and it's this little paintbrush with the marching ants on there, or the marquees tool. It's like a free form. And this smart select tool auto snaps to anything that is considered a contrasting edge. So since I have mountains against a nice, colorful, bright sky, all I had to do was drag it just a slight bit on the sky and it snapped the entire sky. And now that I have this selected with the marching ants, with my dark exposure selected, I'm just going to hit the mask button. And you'll see here, it made a mask that is just that of the sky. So when I turn on and off this dark exposure, it's just swapping out the sky. Now before the class, I was talking to Shawn a little bit. When you get into this kind of stuff, you can definitely introduce some haloing along the edges, especially if your sky, this is part of what I call pre-exposure blending. That's what we did in Lightroom earlier on, where I decreased the highlights of the midground exposure and then increase the shadows of the dark exposure. The reason I do that is to exposure match or pre-exposure blend. That way when we do sky swap like this, you don't get this very harsh line along your ridge where it's quite obvious that you swapped in a different sky from a different exposure, or a completely different photograph if you're doing like compositing or something. But you'll see if I drag along the horizon here, or the mountain edge, we really don't have any of that pronounced haloing, so it looks really natural. But we do have a little bit right here. If I zoom in to 623%, you can see that there is a little bit of highlighting along the edge where the auto snap or auto select tool didn't quite hug the mountain as close as I'd like it. And if we have time later, I'll show, I always do this last, but I'll show how you can remove this, because as we do contrast work, this right here is only going to get worse. So I usually do it, I'll remove this haloing. This is one of my last steps before I publish an image. But it was a pretty clean exposure blend in this case. If you make sure your exposures match as close as possible, then you're not going to have too much issues getting it to look pretty natural. So now we have these two. I'm once again going to merge the layers, and now this is our base layer. So this is kind of all that stuff that we just did was preparing for my main editing workflow. So I kind of consider this, when I start editing, everything before was a lot of prep work and just blending all the shots together to get this fully focused, exposure blended image where everything is exactly where I want it, and the histogram isn't clipping anything, shadows highlight, and we've got nice clarity throughout. So with this, obviously we have some alignment issues where it distorted the images to get the rest of the image to align. So we're going to first crop that out. So we'll go up to our crop, and then we're going to probably do a 5:4. Just eyeballing this, it looks like that crop ratio would work best. And then I'm just going to bring it in a little bit until we get rid of that unwanted stuff along the edge. So that looks pretty good. And then just zoom along to make sure that we got everything. Sometimes when you focus stack, because it does focus breathe, the edges of your image will be really blurry, the very edges, because it keeps the foreground focus. Since it is a bigger image, it'll keep that along the very border, and you want to crop that out as well. But it looks like we're doing pretty good. All right, so the next thing that I'll usually do, if the photograph is asking for it, or if it's necessary in the photograph, I'll do transform tool just to kind of manipulate the landscape ever so slightly. So a lot of you, if you shoot with a wide angle lens, you'll notice that you could be standing in front of a huge mountain that's towering over you. Dream Lake, for example. It's a great example where the Howlett Peak looks massive, and then you bust out your 16mm lens, take a shot, look at the back of your camera, and the mountain seems to just lose all of its scale and its epicness. That's just kind of what wide-angle lenses tend to do, especially the further away the subject matter or the mountain is, the smaller it seems to get. So that's when I usually do this. It's how I justify using something like a transform tool. So what I'll first do is make a copy of my layer. The hotkey for that is, and by hotkey I mean shortcut, the Command J or Control J on a PC. So make a copy, and then I'll hit Control T on my keyboard, and it pops up this transform tool. And there's this thing up here called warp or free transform, and I'll click on that. And what this allows me to do is kind of manipulate. You can see I can drag certain parts of my image around. And if I pull up here and pull down here, it's kind of like working with clay almost. You can manipulate certain aspects of your image, very targeted, localized aspects. And there's this thing up here called grid, split into a 3x3 all the way up to a 5x5 that lets you even target more localized aspect or scale or transform or warp target adjustments. So what I usually do this for is to make my mountains look a little bit more pronounced, or to bring back the scale you lose when you shoot with a wide angle lens. So for example, I might drag this side up a little bit, and then drag this back down and just kind of work it back and forth without losing. You don't want to make it so ridiculous that it looks not real. So it's very finesse amount of warping going on here. And oops. This is actually really, really cool way to bring back scale and just that wow factor to these big mountain scenes. And the river maybe just looks a little bit scrunched, so I might widen it out a little bit to give the photo a little more depth. Once again, being very, very subtle with it. Don't want to make it ridiculous. And then once I feel like I've gotten somewhere that I'm happy with, I'll hit the check mark and that'll save the settings. The reason why I made a base copy is now I can see a before and after. And you see, and I'll spend a lot longer than I just did. I'll do it, I'll look at the before and after, and I'll probably redo it like 5 more times until I'm happy with the way that it turned out. In this case, I probably did a little bit too much on the left side. But for the sake of saving time, I'm just going to continue forward. This image, I don't think it really needs it, but I did want to show this tool. It's a very, very useful tool, especially when you want to make your mountains a little more pronounced. So I'm actually not going to keep it on this. I like the way everything looked, but that is a very common thing that I do before I get into the edit. So I definitely wanted to hit up on that. The next thing that I do before I start localized adjustments is the all world famous Orton Blur that every landscape photographer has probably heard of, and a lot of us probably overuse, including myself. I'm trying to, it's an easy crutch to use on your photographs to make it pop with minimal effort. So it's easy to overdo to where everything looks a little bit too mushy and too glowy and too dreamy. So we're going to jump into the way that I do this. So once again, I'm going to make a copy because I want to see a before and after, and we're going to lower the transparency of this image. Whereas if I didn't have a base layer and I lowered the transparency, obviously we're just going to get that background grid pattern. So we need a solid image behind it to shine through when we do lower the transparency of this Orton Blur. So we make a copy. We're going to go up to filter. And this is the way that I do it. Like Shawn mentioned, there's a million ways to do an Orton Blur. My techniques constantly change. But right now, for the last, I don't know, year to 6 months, this is the way that I've been doing it exclusively. So I go to filter, blur, and I go down to Gaussian blur. That's what is the backbone of the Orton Blur. And when I set my radius here, my pixel or my blur amount, a good rule of thumb is to blur the resolution of your sensor. So if you have a 36 megapixel sensor, blur to a radius of 36 pixels. I think that's just, from what I've seen others do, and from trial and error, that's pretty well accepted rule of thumb in the community. And I'm sure there's other ways to do it. You can always go more, but it's a nice balance. So I hit OK. Obviously, it looks horrible right now. Everything's out of focus. But this is our Orton Blur layer. So I'm going to drop my opacity down to 30%. Once again, these numbers just come from what I found best. And I drop it down to 30. This isn't going to be the final opacity. I'm going to drop it down even more. But I drop it down to 30 so I can get an idea of what the image looks like. But I also want to be able to see these contrast adjustments I'm going to make. So I keep the opacity at a reasonable level. Don't want to drop it too low. Because the next thing that you do when you Orton Blur is add a ton of contrast to that layer. So I'm going to open up a levels adjustment, and that's up here under the adjustments tab. Anyone can customize the way that your right side panel looks and your left side panel. But if you don't have this adjustments pad, if you go to window, there's all these different things, these different sub windows that you can click on and then drag over to anywhere you want. You can snap them onto any of these sidebars. Adjustments has all the exposure levels, tonal curves, vibrancy, hue, saturation, color adjustments, and selective color, and a bunch of other things. So we're going to do levels. And then I'm going to add some contrast to this layer, the base copy. And one way to do that is you can do this clipping layer. So it only applies to the layer below. You'll see this little arrow. The way that I like to do it is if you just have base copy or your Orton Blur. I'm just reading exactly what I have written here. If you have your Orton layer selected, you can do Control L, and it'll open up the levels on that layer directly, so it only affects that layer. So if I drag my sliders in from the right side, these are my highlights, my midtones, so I can brighten my midtones to the left or darken them to the right, and then my shadows. So I'm going to drag my highlights I'm going to overdo this so it looks absolutely disgusting, because then we're going to drop our opacity on this layer even further. And then I'm going to pull my shadows in, and I'm just going to keep squeezing these together, and you'll see it starts to add a ton of saturation to the image, a lot of glow down here. We start to get some pretty disgusting color banding up in the sky, but that's okay because we're going to back off on the opacity. So I really want to exaggerate this. And a lot of this is trial and error and personal preference, but I'm going to get it to somewhere that looks pretty good. So I'm keeping in mind that it's way overdone, but I like the core underlying look to the image. So I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to drag my opacity all the way down to 0. The reason I do this is your eyes are super biased and they can get numb to colors, Orton blurs, contrast. They can adjust to it super quick. So you want to drop down to 0, let your eyes reset. Sometimes I'll get up and look away for 5 seconds and then look at the image, let your eyes get used to what the image looked like before the Orton blur. This is a good technique to prevent you from overusing it, because you just stared at a 30% overly contrasted image for the last 30 seconds. So once my eyes are reset, I'm going to slowly increase the opacity until I get to something that I like. So there's none, and I'm increasing it. I'm ignoring kind of what's going on in the sky. I'm more concerned on the effect that it's having on the midground and on the river, because I'm going to take it out of the sky because I don't want the sky to be too bright. And you can see that it's brightening the sky up. So I usually have a rule where I don't ever take it above 15%. In this case, I think 12 looks great. And I'm looking at my other computer screen to see how much of a difference you guys can see, because it's drastic on my computer, on my BenQ monitor right in front of me, but it's a little more subtle over Zoom. But you'll notice when you play with this yourself, it makes quite the difference. Only going to 12% opacity makes a pretty big difference. Okay, so we've got that set. I'm going to make a mask on it just by clicking this mask button down here. The reason I do this is now I'm going to brush it out of areas I don't want. I'm going to exaggerate this for a second and bring the opacity way up just to prove a point here. You'll see along the edges of really highly contrasting areas, so a dark mountain against a bright sky. When you Orton blur, it's blending the shadows into your highlights, and it's blending your highlights into your shadows. So when you have these contrasting areas, you get this bleed over where now you have this really bright edge along your mountains, and you'll get a really dark edge along your sky, which is another form of haloing, and it starts to separate and get super weird looking. So I always take my Orton blur. I'm going back down to 12%. I always take my Orton blur, and I'm going to take my brush. If you haven't worked with layers in Photoshop, just a quick analogy to what masks or layers, a quick analogy to what a mask is doing. We have 2 layers here, so imagine 2 pieces of paper sitting on top of each other, or 2 photographs just laid on top of your table. When you put a mask on and you start painting with a black paintbrush, that's almost like you are cutting out holes on that top layer and exposing the layer that's underneath of it. So for example, this layer is fully white here, this mask here, which means we're only looking at this top layer, this Orton layer. If I take my paintbrush and I, at 100% opacity on my brush, and I just paint out here, I am pretty much cutting a hole out of that top layer and exposing what's underneath. And you can see when I change in that one spot right here, that one's not being affected. So you're always seeing what's underneath. That's just a really quick crash course on what layers and masks do in Photoshop. So when I add this mask, I can now remove parts of this layer that I don't want in a very targeted manner. So I have my paintbrush. I'm going to set my opacity up here to 50% so that each stroke only applies 50% of that black, so I can work gradually. And I'm going to kind of take it out of the top of the sky here because we started getting some really weird color banding with that Orton layer, because it goes from orange to pink pretty quickly. And the more Orton you do and the more contrast you do, the more you're going to get that color banding. So I'm painting it out of the top. And then I'm also going to go along my ridge here, and I'm just going to paint out the Orton Blur, kind of balancing my brush half sky, half mountain, and I'm going to slowly paint it out of that ridge so we don't get that halo effect that I showed when I kind of exaggerated the opacity on this layer. So now we don't have any of that. It looks really clean on the edges, but we still maintained that Orton look everywhere else in the image. The flowers are quite bright, so I might take my paintbrush at a 20% and just slightly remove a little bit of it around the flowers so they don't look as smudgy and blurry. And this is what will set your Orton Blur apart from everybody else's, is if you put a mask on it and you take the time to custom adjust by removing it and adding it to areas that you want instead of doing some global application of the Orton Blur. So whenever you see those photographs that just look overly dreamy and too mushy, that's usually someone who A, used too much, and then B, just applied it over the entire image without going in and making adjustments to where they wanted it. The key to, in my opinion, to editing at a higher level or a different level than what Lightroom can do is the localized adjustments. The more time you spend localizing and doing local edits, the more painterly and just cinematic and customized your image looks that give it that look that people always ask, how do you get your images to look that way? 90% of the time, the answer is I spent the time to do local adjustments and didn't just do these global adjustments across the entire image. I mean, it's exactly like painting. If you look at my mask here, I'm just painting out what I don't want. So I always think of photography. In my world, digital photography is I'm taking a real photograph and I'm almost digitally painting light and exposures and clarity on top of my image. So if at the end I were to remove all the actual image layers and just keep my empty painted layers, you can see the outline of the landscapes and all the colors and all the light bleeds. So it really is a sense you're painting on your photograph when you're doing this kind of editing. So we have our Orton Blur. It's really hard for me to do this in an hour and a half because I could say a million things about every step that I'm doing. So I'm going to try to keep moving forward here. So once we have the Orton Blur, I do want to add back a little bit of clarity because you do lose a little bit of that detail when you do an Orton Blur. So I'm going to make another layer. It's called a merge visible layer. The shortcut for that is Shift Alt Command E on a PC, and then Shift Option Command E on a Mac. I believe, and it's been so long since I've not used the hotkeys that I start to forget the actual ways that you go up and physically choose to have another merge visible layer. So that might be something, oh, here it is, it's down here. So I get so used to using these shortcuts that sometimes when I'm teaching classes, I get stuck in a spot because I've forgotten how to actually do the step without giving the shortcuts to it. All right, so we have this new layer on top, and I'm going to go up to Filter. I'm going to go to Other, and I'm going to do something called a High Pass Filter. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding detail back to the edges or the very, basically when you do a clarity adjustment, you're adding detail to the fine parts of the photograph. So like, let's say the blade of grass or the details in the mountains and the rocks. So this is kind of doing a similar technique. It's hard to see on Zoom, but you can actually see the embossment on this gray layer of my photograph. And it's not really coming through on the Zoom, but just for the sake of the tutorial, I set it to 1.8 pixels. I hit OK. And then I'm going to set the blend mode to soft light. And that's all that it takes. So let me see if I can get this to come across on Zoom. So, okay, it's so slight. So there's a before, and then if I turn on this layer, you see it. It's such a subtle adjustment. You'll see that it adds clarity to the image when I turn this layer on. So it's one of those things that you'll see a lot when you're in person editing your photograph. And it's just adding that detail, that fine detail back into your image after your Orton blur. So now we get that dreamy effect without compromising our sharpness and our clarity. You'll just have to take my word for it. And when you try it, you'll see the difference much more than you're seeing over the Zoom call. All right, so now that we've got our Orton blur and our clarity layer, this is when I usually start to do a little bit of midtones contrast adjustment and some shadow adjustments. And I'm going to use the curves layers for this, but I'm going to target them to my shadows, my midtones, and my highlight regions. So there's this tool up here that I'm using, and you'll see it split out into many different panels here with these abbreviations, RP, IM, C, all the way through EP. This is called Raya Pro. It's a luminosity mask tool that I bought probably 3 years ago, and it's a plugin for Photoshop that makes luminosity masks. And those are masks that are based on the brightness levels of your photograph. So it auto-generates those, and then you can apply them to all kinds of different adjustment layers. So this is where that targeted editing comes in. You can also do these by hand manually, and I do have a YouTube video on this. It takes way too long to get into, and especially for a tutorial like this, but basically you're going through your channels and you're making highlights, midtones, and shadow masks based on those luminosities or those exposure levels, and then you can custom adjust them using level adjustments. So there's a reason why someone made a tool like this, because it's a lifesaver. And they do have a free version. It's called Easy Panel. That's what this EP is. So his name is Jimmy McIntyre, and maybe I can have Shawn email out these details in after the class here. So it's called Easy Panel, and you can click on this. So this is free. Highly recommend it if you work with luminosity masks at all. And you'll see here we have our bright luminosity masks, our dark luminosity masks, and our midtone luminosity masks. So I'm going to do some adjustments to my midtones, and just to show what this is doing, when I click on this, what it's doing is it's going through and doing all these manual steps that I just kind of went over, and I have a video on my YouTube channel how to manually make these masks. It's doing it automatically, putting them in a folder, and then you can see here there's 6 masks that are more and more targeted on the midtone. So if I click these masks, you'll see we have our most the most loose midtones mask that's most encompassing of both the highlights and the shadows nearest to the midtones, all the way down to the most restricted mask, which is just targeting the most midtones of the midtones. I apologize if I'm not doing a good job explaining this. It's quite a complex concept, luminosity masks. There's tons of good resources online, free videos on YouTube, where people do a much better job at explaining what luminosity masks are. But basically what I'm doing is I'm finding the mask that I want. So when I do contrast adjustments or do any adjustments, let's say dodge and burning, and I do a midtones mask, everything that is white or light gray, my adjustments will be applied to, and it'll avoid applying them to anything that's dark gray or black. So these are huge in many photographers' editing workflows. So I'm going to take this, I think number 5 looks pretty good. I'm just trying to find one that's selecting a good amount without being too all-encompassing. So I think 4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this mask with the marching ants, and I did that by holding down Command and clicking on the mask. I know there's a lot of information that I'm throwing at you guys, but luckily this is being recorded, and it took me many hours and years to finally kind of memorize everything here. So I've got my marching ants on this mask, and then I can go up to a levels adjustment, click levels adjustment, and now it's applied that mask automatically to my levels adjustment. So you can see here, that's the mask on the level. So now when I do adjustments on this, it's only applying it to the midtones. So I can raise the luminosity or the exposure of my sky by dragging this to the left, and then darken just my midtones by dragging this slider to the right. And you'll see we get a really nice moody contrast to the image when I do it this way, as opposed to just doing a global levels adjustment. So once I get it to something that I like, and it's about right there, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make, I can probably take this because I'm done with this right now, these masks. I'm going to trash those. I'm going to use that tool and make another mask on my darks. So it's generating the masks on all the darks in this image. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to fade my shadows. This is it's a look that I really like. It definitely helps add to that painterly effect on your image, because when you're painting, you obviously don't have perfect blacks, like pure blacks, but when you're editing a photograph digitally, you can definitely get these blacks that are just pure blacks. They're completely clipped and they're dark. Printers and different print labs have a horrible time printing these and looking good without getting a weird purple shine to them. So it's always good practice for printing to fade your blacks a little bit. And by fade, I mean you're taking your histogram. Maybe if I actually open my histogram here, taking my histogram and I'm pulling my shadows from the left side and actually making some space in there between the blackest of the blacks and my darkest pixel, and I'm pulling that over so that those dark pixels, even my darkest pixels that are pure black, are really more of a very dark gray, and a lot of people just call that fading of shadows. So I'm going to choose something that's very targeting. You can see the more inclusive ones kind of include a lot of the darks, whereas the most restricted just include the darkest of the darks in this image. I'm going to do that on this one because I just want to fade the very dark pixels. That's this number 6 here. Once again, I'm going to command click on the image to get the marching ants. Go to my adjustments and click levels. I'm going to pull this levels layer out of this folder called masks so that I can delete it since I got the masks that I needed. And now when let's see if I'm going to zoom in on a dark area here. So if I take this bar down here and drag it from the left to the right, you'll see it fades my darks into this dark gray. So from pure black to dark gray. And the more that I do this, the more the photograph starts to look like something that you painted with colored pencils or oil pastels. And this is a big part in making your photographs give that painterly look. I usually will fade it to about anywhere from a 3 output level here to a 5. And just to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to pull my histogram off here. Let's hope I can get it back when I'm done. I think it won't let me make this any bigger for some reason. Well, I hope you all can see the histogram up here, but if I take my output level and I pull this all the way, you'll see that it's separating my darks from the left side. So I'm providing some separation here, and I'm obviously exaggerating it quite a bit just so you can see what I was talking about earlier. So I usually go from a 3 to an 8 because I don't want it to be too faded because then you lose some of that contrast. But I also don't want to have any pure blacks, and I like a painterly look. So I'll go, let's do a 7 on this one. So zooming back out, just for the sake, I'm going to darken this a little bit so we can see the image a little better. So we can see it before and after. it's looking a little more exaggerated on the zoom screen that I'm looking at. It's not quite as faded as that looks that all of you are looking at on my screen. It's a little more subtle, just to put that out there. Yeah, you can see it fades the image, and now it looks even more like dreamy, more painterly. And it also gives me a nice baseline where I can add more contrast work like local adjustments, including dodging and burning, without getting too overly contrasty, globally speaking, like over the entire image. So it softens up those shadows a bit, because harsh shadows, in my opinion, don't really look that good. So we've faded our shadows. We've done some midtones adjustments. You can see the difference before that, and then our Orton Blur. So from the beginning to where we are now, we're kind of moving backwards. It looks like we're getting a less appealing image aesthetically because we've faded it and kind of blurred everything a little bit. But it took me a while to kind of accept that. As we go through the dodging and burning process, we start to add that contrast back in, but only where we want it, and it really starts to make that image pop. So I'm actually, for this one, looking at this again, going to drop that down to probably a 4 instead of a 7. I don't need to fade it quite as much. All right, now we get to the fun stuff. So we have a nice baseline here, and we're going to start our light work. So painting with light. Light is everything apart from composition. Composition and light are the two most important things in landscape photography. Light, as you all probably know, can make or break a good composition. You could have a great river leading to a cabin in mountains with flowers in the foreground. But if your sky is gray and you have no light, then the image looks flat and it just really doesn't come across that great. Vice versa, if you have great light in a poor composition, the image is more likely to look better because light, in my opinion, trumps composition when you have really nice, steep, angled, golden hour light or glow from a sky. It just adds so much life and depth to a photograph. So light work, or painting light and dodging and burning and light bleeding, is huge for bringing life to your photograph and just kind of taking it to the next level. So what I'm going to do first, I do think this part of the sky is a little bright because I'm going to add more light there, believe it or not, but I'm going to do it in a light bleeding way with a soft light paintbrush or blend mode on an empty layer. So what I'm first going to do is create another merge visible on all of these. Let's see here. All right. For some reason, my keyboard is not wanting to merge all these layers. So let me... All right, so I'm going to open this up. So I have this new layer here that has all those adjustments on. I'm going to Shift Command A to open up what's called Adobe Camera Raw. This is the Lightroom of Photoshop. It's got all the similar features, the basic adjustments, all the way through the calibration adjustments that I talked about earlier, except it's built within Photoshop. So we don't have to jump back to Lightroom. So I like this. It's a relatively new tool, and they keep making improvements to it. So I'll open it up on a single layer so I can kind of go back to what's more familiar to make stuff like highlights adjustments, because I said I wanted to drop this. It looked a little bit bright. You can see as I drop this down, I'm bringing back some of that detail in here. And I'm going to hit OK, and you'll see the difference. It's global at this point, but I don't want it to apply to everything. So I'm going to once again add a mask to this layer. If while I'm on this mask, you can, let's see here, have the mask selected and do a Command I, and that's going to flip the mask to a black mask. That's how you invert it. So now nothing's showing on this layer. And I'm just going to go to the bright parts of the sky, and I'm just going to paint it into this area because that is all that I want. So I get a white paintbrush, maybe make my opacity around a 50, and then I'm just going to paint it in just where I want it. I sometimes feel like well, actually, a lot of times I feel like Bob Ross when I'm trying to explain dodging and burning. But it feels a lot like that when you get really close to your landscape and just make these local adjustments. So you can see here, I just reduced the highlights in that specific area. So then when I add some light bleeding there to give more of that effect that the light's bleeding over from where the sun's rising, I'm not going to blow out my highlights. So I'm priming that spot so that I can add some more light. I would usually use a luminosity mask to do this, but I don't want to drag on too far or get too long in all these details, which is why my tutorials can actually go on for like a good 4 hours getting into everything that I do. So we have this. I'm going to make a new layer. This is just an empty layer here. The shortcut for that is Shift Alt Command N on a PC or Shift Option Command N on a Mac. That makes this new blank layer. I'm going to change the blend mode to soft light so that it doesn't apply what I'm about to paint on here to everything on the image, just to the soft light of the image. I have my color tabs open up here. The really cool thing about this technique is now I can paint with not only exposure, but I can inject color into my brush. So I have color selected up here. I have my brush. I've got soft light blend mode set in. We're going to paint some sunlight or bleed it in over that horizon to give a really nice source of light and that ethereal look to the photograph. So I'm going to hold Option or Alt on a PC to get our little sampler here. And as you can see, I'm sampling up here. You'll see the color up here on my color palette change to that color. For example, if I click here, it's green. If I click here, it's going to be more purples. And then I'm going to sample right around where the sun's rising. So we've got kind of this yellow-orange look. So now that I've got the color that's kind of representative of what's going on here, I'm going to drag it up into the left. When you drag to the left, you desaturate. To the right, you saturate. Up is increase your exposure, and down is decrease the exposure. So obviously top left is white, bottom right is going to be black, and anywhere in between is just different shades of that color. So I'm going to go somewhere, you get kind of a feel for it, but somewhere about 10 to 20% along saturation, and then all the way bright. Because we're painting in light here, so we need a lot of brightness. I'm going to back out a little bit, set my brush to 20%, and then I'm just going to start lightly adding sunlight to this area right here. And I'm just doing little circles, shrinking it down to where the sun might crest up over that peak. And then I'm just going to add a little light. I think we could go a little more saturated. And then I'm going to slowly just kind of lighten up. I use a Wacom tablet, by the way. They're really awesome for editing because it makes it feel more like you're painting on something or drawing. It's much more natural. And it's pressure sensitive, so the lighter I push on my Wacom tablet, the lower this opacity goes. So when I set it to 20, what's that saying is maximum, if I press my pen as hard as I can, it's only going to be 20%. So as I lighten up, I'm anywhere from 0 to 20. So I just do these light strokes outwards from the sun and kind of just go across my landscape a little bit here, sourcing, kind of always starting where that sun is coming up from the mountain. And you'll see it just starts to add a ton of life to the photograph. So we have a before and an after, and we're starting to get some light spilling across the landscape. This is called light bleeding. If you ever wanted to do some more specific YouTubing of this, there's a ton of tutorials on light bleeding, and I have a few of my own. And my technique I've just kind of developed unique to myself over time. And I might just add a little bit more orange to my color and a little more saturation just to target on the center to get a little more warmth in there. Once I've got that, I'm going to do one more new layer. This is the second part of the light bleeding technique, where we're going to set the blend mode to overlay. So this adds that really, really intense, focused light that's going to be clipping our highlights. This is the only time where I'm pretty much okay with clipping my highlights. I'm going to keep the color where it's at. I'm going to shrink my brush down increase the opacity to probably something around 50. And I'm just going to kind of dab my brush a little bit here, just around the horizon. And it kind of gives that glow that the sun is actually much more dreamy and closer to the horizon than it might be. And when you have a sun star that you capture on your camera, this works great. It adds a lot of softness to that sun star. And so if I zoom out a little bit, I just want to show before and after of what I did here. So let's group these two together, and then we can turn it on and off together. So you can see this alone has done more than anything we've done as far as aesthetic difference in the photograph that we've done thus far. So you can see it adds a lot of light, a lot of that ambient softness to the image. So dodging is not powerful without burning. Dodging refers to brightening parts of the areas. This is a form of dodging, even though it is called light bleeding. Burning is darkening parts of the area. And it comes, it draws back to the darkroom days when they used to use popsicle sticks or little shapes to reduce exposure to a developing photograph to dodge it. And then they would burn it by exposing extra light to the photograph to darken it. So more light during exposure would darken it, less light would let the exposure be a little bit lighter, hence the terms dodging light and then burning, exposing a lot of light. So if we go up to our dodge and burn tool here on Photoshop, you'll see the dodge tool is like a little popsicle stick. So you're dodging the light or casting shadows during the development of the photograph. And then the burn tool is when you're, in this example, they're making a little hole with their hand so that you're allowing light through a specific part of the photograph. Just a quick background. Not that it was necessarily needed at this part of the tutorial, but that's okay. So I'm going to add a layer to this dodge and burn, a mask to this dodge and burn layer so I can paint out the light where I don't want it. Like I said, dodging is nothing. It's not nearly as powerful by itself as it is when you couple it with dodging, because you're getting even more contrast. So we kind of painted sloppily over everything there, even in these parts of the hills that wouldn't see light in the real world or didn't see light when I was actually there. So I'm going to make that layer, get a black brush, and do this really quick. I actually spend a lot of time dodging. It's kind of therapeutic in my opinion, a little meditative, this dodging and burning technique. So I'm going to go over and just paint out, where the light on some of these, the texture in this hill here, where the light wouldn't actually ever get. And I'm going to do this extremely crudely for the sake of not spending too much time on this. But had me editing my own photo, I would spend probably anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes just removing the light bleed that I just did from areas that I don't want it. So quickly, I'm just taking all the areas that were already dark and I'm taking out that light bleed. So on the backside of this hill, on the backside of the trees, on the backside of the cabin here, on the backside of this cabin, and then obviously in the contours of the hills and the baseline of those trees and on the mountain, and you get the point. I'm just trying to do enough to where you can see the difference. And then probably a little bit on the backside of this one to bring back some contrast. And I'm not going to go too far. All right. Like I said, I would have spent another 30 minutes probably doing that. So you can see with before the mask that I just did, where everything's kind of washed out and a little more generally applied. And then after the mask, we just added a ton of realism back into the light bleed that we just did and a lot of contrast. So now you can see before. Sure, it's a great image as is, but when you add that light and you get that shadows casting across the hills and around the trees and on the ridges of each hill line where the light would hit, it just adds so much more to the photograph. So yeah, once again, before and after. So that was a quick light bleed. Next, we're actually going to get into what's really dodge and burning, where we're going to take that light bleed, that was our source of light, And now we're going to go across the landscape and kind of ask ourselves, or use the template of the landscape to see where the ambient light is already being cast upon. And we're going to ask ourselves, where is the light? And target those areas and paint in more color injected light into those areas to make this effect that we just did even more pronounced. So we're going to start with another blank layer with that Shift Option Command N. We're going to sample the color of our light. So we got like that nice yellow. We're going to bring it up here. Probably add a little more contrast in this case, or sorry, saturation. If you ever get this a little symbol here that has a exclamation mark next to it, all that's telling you is that this color that I've selected is not really in the gamut for printing. So your typical print lab will not be able to print that color exactly how it is, but I've found that it's never really that big of a deal. If you click on it, it'll just auto adjust your color within the color gamut that is printable. Just in case you ever, when you do come across what that little warning is, that's Photoshop telling you like, this is not a printable color, so we're gonna do something close to. Doesn't make a huge difference though. So now that we've got our color, we're gonna go to an overlay blend mode. This is best for dodging because it keeps and maintains that clarity. Soft light kind of softened things up a little bit. And we did enough of that with our light bleed. And then here's the important part. We're going to go to our easy panel that we all downloaded for free. The paid version or features in it, but they all make luminosity masks. We're going to go to our midtones because I want to be able to paint light in, but I don't want to paint it into the shadows, and I don't want to paint it into the very bright highlights. I don't want to blow out my highlights, and then I don't want to lighten my shadows. The point of this is increasing contrast. So I'm going to apply a midtones mask to it. And if you see these masks, let me select one, you'll see these parts of the bushes that are already naturally kind of lit by the light. You can see along the edges, and these oh man, I'm blanking on the name of these tall flowery stock plants that bloom like once every 70 years. I'm blanking on the name of those, but what's that?
I think they're green gentians.
Yeah, I think, yeah, they have like 3 names, but I definitely think you're right on that one. So you can see the areas where the light is, and if I go to this mask, the white areas are what's being allowed through or what I'm going to be applying it to, and you can see it's already perfectly targeting what I want it to target. So I'm going to select this mask, Control, click on the mask, and then I'm going to go to my new layer and click the mask button. And when you have those marching ants highlighted and you click this mask button, it takes what's selected and makes that a mask. Nice and convenient. And then we can trash our masks because we got the one that we needed. So now when I paint, it's only applying it to the midtone, so I can be a little more sloppy about my painting. I don't have to get really into every single leaf because that would take forever. So I've got my overlay, I've got my mask, I've got my new layer, and I'm going to do an opacity of 30% up here. And now you'll see as I paint in, and let me see if this is coming across on the zoom. Yeah, you can see as I'm painting in, we're lightening up the tops of these bushes. So I can kind of just go along this ridge. And this is the part that takes a little bit of artistic decision making. So you have to know, you don't want to paint it in areas where the light's not hitting or it would look not as realistic. So you just kind of look and you're like, where is the light hitting? Or if the light's not really hitting that area, but you know it would, and you want to give the illusion that it is to add a little bit of more dynamicism to your photograph, then you can definitely paint it into those areas. So I'm quickly going through this. Like I said, I like to get way zoomed in and a little crazy and a little Bob Rossi on all this stuff. But I'm just going to go very quick. And because we have this mask selected, I don't really have to think too hard about whether I'm accidentally painting in my shadows or not, because the mask is not allowing that to happen. We'll come up here, we'll do some broad strokes. In my opinion, yeah, my brain's telling me to slow down and that it looks a little sloppy, but once again, I'm trying to just get as much done so we can see a good before and after. So the concepts still apply, but take your time with this kind of stuff. It definitely makes a difference. I've noticed in my photographs when I'm in a hurry and just kind of cut corners on my dodge and burning, I always come back to my photograph the next day and I'm like, why does this photograph not look as good as the rest of my gallery, or it's just not quite living up to my expectations of my own work? That's usually because I rushed the targeted adjustments and I didn't spend the time to really get in and dodge and burn and paint in the light where I want it. All right, that was pretty good. Let's hit this foreground a little bit right here. The reason why I'm avoiding the flowers is that's their whole own, that's a whole nother ballpark. They have their own special treatment because it's the closest thing to the lens. So I have this rule of thumb: the closer you get to the lens, the more time you should spend dodging and doing targeted editing. The further away you get from the lens, the more kind of broad strokes you can make with your brushes, because it's further away and the atmosphere will disperse the light and diffuse the light a little more. So it doesn't really matter if you're not super, super precise. All right, let's see if that made a pretty big difference. Oh yeah, that's huge. Okay. So I probably overcooked it in the back a little bit, but that's okay. I would reduce that if I had time. So you can see that we just added a ton of texture to this hill, which makes this light that we just put here feel even more purposeful, like it actually belongs in that area. So here's before both. Any light work, here's the image as is, and then here's with all that light work. So we just added a ton of just yummy, just fantastical, dreamy, ethereal aspects to this photograph. And the next thing that I would do is get even closer. Let's see, how are we on time? We're about an hour and a half in. So just give me a heads up so I can kind of just keep moving forward if I need to speed things up a bit here. But what I would do next, and since I've already kind of covered how you make the dodge and burn, do a new layer, do the overlay, select the color of the flower, brighten it up, the same steps that we did before. And then I'm going to take this mask that I already made, and you can hold Alt, click the mask and drag it up, and it makes a duplicate copy, so I don't have to make that again. So that saves us some time. And then I'm just going to paint in on these flowers a little bit, lower my opacity just a slight. That was a little too much. I'm going to paint around the edges of the flower where the light would hit, not behind the flower here, and not on the back side of the flower, because that just obviously light's not going to bend around and hit the back side of the stalk or the flowers that are facing the camera here. I'm only going to do the very edges where the light would catch. And going to hurry through this just to get the idea. And this is where I would usually spend just on these flowers. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm zoomed in about this much, and I'm painting each individual petal. I mean, you can spend as much time as you want, but you definitely, when you put the work in, you'll definitely see a difference. So we paint the flowers just really quickly. I do the same with the leaves around the area. I would probably put some, you can see the lights already catching on the outside of the stalk. There's a nice thin bit of light as the light's catching the hairs around the edge of the stalk of the leaf, so you can paint those brighter. Anything to convince that the light is stronger than it was. And you can see before and after, we've already just brightened up the edges of those flowers, and it just adds so much to the foreground of the image. And if you really want to get creative, I mean, you can do things like the hue and saturation, target your flowers, and you can get as crazy as making them a little more orange colored and is doing it to the whole image, but you can then mask everything out and just paint it onto the flowers. If your flowers are a little bit too yellow and you want to make them a little more orange, I mean, you can mess with the colors and do targeted color adjustments. That would be a whole nother 2-hour tutorial on its own on all the color grading that I do and the targeted coloring work that I do just to make everything blend a little bit better together. So once we have this done, I'm going to make a new merge visible. because I want to open up Adobe Camera Raw, and it can only do that on merged layers. So I'm going to go to that calibration technique that I talked about earlier. And at this point, after my contrast work, I'm not worried I'm going to oversaturate. So I'm going to drag this up to add color to the image. And you can see it even adds a little bit of light in the highlights, but it adds more vibrancy, highlights to the midtones, and saturation where the saturation is the least. And while I'm in here, I'll probably also do stuff like where I put graduated filters on the foreground because I want to add a little bit of clarity and texture to my flowers. They are closer to the lens, so we do want to give the appearance that they are more in focus. So we're going to add some texture and some clarity, and we'll probably hit OK on that one. So you can see the foreground got a little bit brighter and a little more texture and clarity to it, and overall the image got more color and vibrancy and pop to it. It doesn't come across on zoom as much as it is when you're actually looking at it on your monitor. And then let's do our final thing. There's a bunch of other things that I would do as well. Like I said, color adjustments, split toning, where I apply warm tones to the highlights, cooler tones to the shadows. But I'm gonna, since we're running out of time, I'm gonna do the vignette because this is very important. This is also another technique of working with light or shaping your light. So we're gonna take light, we want the eye to focus. This is the part where you're really driving the eye using light or lack thereof. You're really driving the eye where you want the viewer to look. So I opened up a tones layer. I'm gonna take this on the very top right and drag the highlights down. You'll see the image start to darken. And then I'm going to take the actual tones curve and also drag it down a little bit. You'll see the image darken even more. And then I'm going to invert my mask so that it's not applied to anything. And I'm going to take my brush at 100%. I'm going to zoom out, make my brush pretty big, and then I'm going to just start painting in what I just did on this layer. And you can see that it's just darkening where I'm painting. I'm going to vignette, I'm hand painting a vignette in. They do have that vignette tool in Lightroom and the Adobe Camera Raw. It's that slider, but you just don't get the same. I'm telling you, the more you take the time to customize these local adjustments with painted layers, where you're just painting in exactly where you want it, the better your photograph's going to look. This is why I'm not a big believer in Lightroom presets. I don't think I've used them ever because each photograph is so different. I just think they each need their own attention to detail, and they're all so different. I'll even paint my vignette into the backside of hills like this, where the light shouldn't be, and it should be a little more shaded. And we can kind of bring out that river by doing this. And on the backside of the mountains here, and on the backside of the trees. And then if I hit the flowers a little bit too much, I'll change to a black brush and remove that effect a little bit on the flowers to bring them back. And then a little bit up here on top, a little bit over here. And yes, okay. So you see a before and an after. Just that alone added so much depth and guides your eye right to the center point, and then kind of drives it down the river and then to this brighter area to the flowers. So that's what I wanted. I want the viewer to either start here or start here and then kind of just meander up to the light here, but not go too far. So we darken the sky to drive the eye back down, and we darken the edges here and in the corners and in the hills here to keep the eye kind of centered along the river. So once again, there's the before and then the after. So let's take everything and group it, and we'll look at the before we've done anything, and then after all the adjustments we just made. Huge difference. I mean, you just completely revolutionized the way that this photograph looks, mostly with working with light. It's such a powerful thing. And everything's localized. I hardly did any global adjustments. I just want to drive into that point. Local adjustments are the key. They take a little bit longer, but they definitely results in your photographs looking very unique and kind of separate yourself from the crowd. And you can, if this is all, you take it as far as you want. The more you add color and the more light you do, the more dramatic you can be. I mean, you can do a whole nother light bleed if you're not happy and you want the sun to be even more intense. You could just take another layer and keep adding. Oops, you want to do the right blend mode. On soft light, you can keep adding light until you just have a like really intense bleed, which I don't like to get too crazy. But yeah, you can see you can just keep adding as much as you want, and it's kind of up to you. But these are the techniques that I use on every single one of my photographs. And I skipped out on a little bit of things like color work, but this image is pretty solid as far as colors go. And adding warm to highlights, cool colors to the shadows, that's pretty easy to do using luminosity masks. And then once you save this image, so we're going to do a Control S here to save, and you'll see down here the save status bar. It's saving the TIFF. And the nice thing about editing from Lightroom is when you jump back to Lightroom, once it saves, let me give it a second. It's probably going to take a little longer since I'm also screen sharing and running Zoom in the background. So once it's saved, we go back to Lightroom, and you'll see the TIFF is already in here. So it puts it right next to the raw photographs that we just edited. So let's look at resetting everything minus the crop. And we're just going to set this crop back really quick. Here's the before. What we started with a raw photograph. We focus stacked all of our images, and we exposure blended the sky and did a bunch of Orton Blur, contrast work, local dodge and burning techniques, and then this is the after that we get. So, I mean, it's huge. And it's more than half the fun, I would say, is editing a photograph. I mean, you get to relive the scene and really spend a lot of time with it. All right, I think that's about it. From here, I would just export, because I love Lightroom's exporting features, and I have a bunch of presets, Colorado through Iceland, Wyoming for my website. Everything's got a different preset for Instagram to optimize sharpness on Instagram and Facebook. So it's nice that you can save those kinds of export presets. But other than that, I think that's a crash course of my workflow. Even though it was over an hour and a half, I probably would have doubled the time that I spent on editing this photograph had it been just me alone working on this. But those are the techniques.
Awesome. Now that was very good, Ben. Appreciate it. A lot of wonderful detail there. I'll open up to questions. If people have questions, you can unmute yourself or type into the chat window.
That's if I haven't made everyone fall asleep by now.
I'm not. And before anyone, Carl, who's our webmaster, he and I have been, like, some of the things you've been mentioning with the luminosity masks, the free download, the Wacom tablet. We're gathering that information. He's going to compile it all together, send us an email, everyone in the club. So if you have anything else you want to include in an email that we send out, I see on your website you have 2 paid tutorials. Do you have somewhere else, like do you have a paid part of your YouTube channel that you'd want us to link to?
No, everything on YouTube is free. I mean, I just I have a whole thing called Quick Stop Photoshop. So I keep all the videos under 10 minutes, and they're just like, one's light bleeding, one's dodging with color, one's focus stacking. So everything that I covered in this is broken down into a more focused 10-minute snippet, really.
Yeah, I've seen those. Those are great little, like say, snippet tutorials.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. We appreciate it. So if anyone has some questions, please fire away.
Yeah, I mean, I could just like quickly list off everything I did. Maybe it'll trigger some.
Okay. Yeah, that might.
Yeah, it was a lot. So it's hard. I always have a hard time thinking of questions after being just fired upon with a machine gun of just stuff. By the end, it kind of all blurs together. Yeah, so yeah, we started in Lightroom. We had the focus stacking, exposure blending in Photoshop, the warp tool. Then we moved into our Orton Blur, and then did some recovery of the detail work. Some contrast tonal adjustments or levels adjustments to the midtones, so luminosity masks, and then fading our shadows, which gives it a nice painterly look. And then we got right into light bleeding and dodging, and then burning, some vignetting, some color work with the color calibration, and then yeah, exporting it back to Lightroom, which is really just as easy as save as. When you jump from Lightroom to Photoshop, it automatically keeps the ties back to Lightroom. Yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, we got Dan Greenberg's his great presentation. I agree. I thought you did, your presentation skills are wonderful.
I
It
appreciate
shows
it.
that you put a lot of time into this. And Laura, she's not asleep, stunned. But anyone else have any other questions or comments for Ben?
Ben, this is Dave Hull. I have one question for you. I'm not familiar with the merge concept. I guess I always like having options. Maybe I could delete a layer or an adjustment layer or whatever. But it's almost like, once the eggs are scrambled, I can't unscramble them. So am I correct that once you merge these layers, there's no way to unmerge them?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, so there's the non-destructive and destructive schools of editing, and I kind of mix them both. When I do stuff like light bleeding, which is I kind of categorize that as one of the bold editing techniques that if I come back 10 minutes later, sometimes I hate what I did. So when I'm doing my light bleeding, I'll try to make sure I don't merge for a while because I know I'll change my mind later. But yeah, once you merge, like let's say I select all these layers and then I right click merge layers. Once you do that, yeah, you're burning all the pixels onto one layer. So you can't go back, for example, and like change this or turn this layer off. Like right now, all these layers I can turn off and you can see whatever order. I can remove the sun that I just did. But once this layer's on, all that does nothing because it's all burned into that layer. So yeah, there's no going back. You have to be pretty confident with what you've done so far if you want to merge the layers. So I usually wait until I'm convinced that I did a tasteful job at whatever, light bleeding or dodging.
All right, well, I appreciate the
merge visible is a little bit different, isn't it? Because if you get to that point and you merge visible, if you don't like it, you can go back and delete that layer and go back and do something else. Yeah.
It's different than merging layers, which takes everything, like you just mentioned. If I just go to layers and just merge, so it's called merge visible. So that's when you merge all your layers. So the shortcut that I'm using, it's not up on the bar. It's that Shift Option Command E instead of just the Shift Command E. When you throw in that option, it's merging the visible, but it's maintaining all the layers that you did. It's not smashing them all. It's almost like smashing them all, making a copy, and then separating the two. So like you said, you can always turn off or delete this layer if you do the merge visible, yet retain technique. I don't even know if there's a name for that, but does that make sense?
Isn't that basically the difference between merging layers as you're doing it is a temporary thing, but flattening is where you're actually compressing them all together, and it saves that as a flattened image with all your corrections are baked in, kind of thing.
Yeah, when you flatten it, like you said, if I merge visible, I just flatten them all into one. Now I have this one layer. If I take all these layers, let me ungroup these really quick because it's gonna kind of be weird for a second. Well, there it is. Sorry, I lost track of it. So if I select all the layers and whatever layers I have selected, I can merge in or flatten into one layer. So if I have these three and I merge the layers, it's going to take those 3 layers and put them into one. If I do what you said and I do the Shift Option Command E, it does flatten the layers into one, but it doesn't remove the layers prior to that. So like you said, I can delete this layer and still have everything else, but I could also delete all these layers. Hold on here. I'm trying to work with the lag going on here. And I still have that same layer that I just flattened. So it's the merge visible is doing that extra step of deleting all the layers below it. Whereas this step makes that flattened baked in layer, but it also keeps everything that I've done so far. So if I ever do want to delete layers to save space, I can, as long as I have that layer that I just made. It's what I use to temporarily do it, like you said. If I'm not quite sure that I'm happy with what I'm doing, but I do want to do some Adobe Camera Raw adjustments on a merge visible, I'll do it this way so that if later I end up hating it, I can just delete that layer and then I'll still have everything underneath. But in the end, when I'm trying to save space, I'll definitely select a good chunk of layers and then just merge them together just to save all that room. So it's not like a 10 gigabyte file. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can merge the layers. I mean, they're all doing the same thing. They're taking everything that you've done and baking them into a single layer. But some get rid of everything and just do that single layer. Some do that merged layer, but maintain everything that you've done. And then you can also just say, oh, I just want to merge the layers up to my light bleed because I'm confident with all the work I've done up to that point, but I still can remove this light bleed. So I only merge some of the layers, and that's what I do most often. I always make sure my light bleed's not baked in because it's one of those things where I'll definitely second guess myself if I did it too much. So I always save that layer. That way I can just delete it and start over versus starting over from scratch. Plus my wife always tells me that I've overcooked things, and she's always right. The next day I'll agree with her, but your eyes get very used to looking at that image, so it's hard to get a fresh perspective. It's good to take 10-minute breaks and walk around the house. I do that a lot when I'm editing these photographs, especially I'm like an hour in. And then you come back and you're like, wow, that's way too warm or way too purple, or that doesn't look real, way too much light bleed in the center or too much dodging, or etc.
Well, Ben, I thought this was an excellent presentation. I so appreciate you kind of going through step by step, showing us what's possible. So it opened my eyes to a number of tools. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I realize there's a lot of stuff, but it's good it's being recorded. That's kind of my goals. When I hear things are going to be recorded and posted, I just take the throw as much as I can into the presentation approach, because then everyone can kind of go back and review everything, so you get more bang for your buck. If it was like unrecorded, of course I would spend time on one single technique so you can actually walk away with something. But appreciate it. I'm glad it was useful.
Yeah, I agree. This was very useful and opened eyes to a whole different way of processing photos.
Yeah, it's I think it took me a while to kind of stumble across this, but this like approach, I used to be all Lightroom, and I just wanted that. I was just addicted to that like cinematic look. Definitely turns heads, and yeah, I mean, there's other. I didn't really ever get to. I'm sure some of you know what the Nick collection is. I use that almost every single time too. I avoided it in this one just so, because it's not free. It used to be free, but then they took it off, and then it came back a free version, and then it's Google owns this one, and then Google made it unfree again, so it just keeps going back and forth. And I managed to snag it while it was free.
There's a link out there, and I'll have to dig it up, but I've recently found it. There's still, if you go through their support site, you can find the free version still.
Okay.
Um,
So I
one
actually
As
have-
far as I know, Nick Collection currently is owned by DxO.
did they buy it
not
back?
Yeah,
Excuse
DxO
me?
owns it. Yep.
Okay. Because
Yeah.
Google
Yes.
used to.
Google did used to, yeah, and
Okay.
I think you could still find the free version of the Google version at least.
I have a video here from 8 months ago, where I say Nick Collection is still free. So I didn't know. I had someone told me this link doesn't work anymore, but maybe it came back. So it is on my YouTube channel.
Your channel is where I found it. That's right. So it
Let me
is
see if
working.
it still works. I'm just checking it while I'm here. Oh yeah, it still works. All right, cool. Well, it's back. Someone told me that it didn't work anymore, but maybe they were. I just kind of took their word for it.
Question for you. I saw you have Luminar there on one of your filters.
Are we
Sky-
talking about on
Skyline?
Photoshop?
Yeah. I cannot get,
Oh,
is there a trick to, mine will not launch from within
Where-
Photoshop? Down
where
there at
are
the bottom,
you?
Skylum.
This guy right here. Oh yeah.
Yeah, so my Luminar 4 will not launch as an
Hmm.
application within. I didn't know if you'd come across that.
Mine does not launch either within. It launches as its own window, but it kind of like Lightroom does, where it'll launch this photograph to Luminar. Once I save in Luminar, it re-exports it back to Photoshop.
And
Is that what you're
mine
talking
won't
about?
even, yeah, mine won't even launch the external application. There must be some patch or update that's not.
I heard about that. I think I might have actually struggled with that too, and I reached out to customer support. This was a while ago. The only thing I use this for, because they tried to be like a different Lightroom, which they have a lot of cool stuff. I only use it for sun rays, believe it or not. They have a really cool algorithm. So if I drag this sun around, if I hide it behind the mountains, you'll see the rays kind of trace the highlights and shadows. So it makes it look, you can see it's pretty sweet. So if you wanted to make the sun look like it was coming up here, you can see that line. You have to be really careful with it though, because it can look super fake. So I'll use it as like a footprint sometimes, and then dial way back on all these adjustments here, and then just paint it in. Because when I hit done or apply, it makes it as a new layer on my Photoshop window, and then you'll see here, now we have that new layer. I'll mask it out, and then I'll just paint in kind of where I want it. So for example, just kind of paint it in like this and just make it look more real. But I do have some, as little as you might want to believe, I do have some morals and values about how far I take a photograph, but sometimes those Luminar ones get a little bit too, a little bit too unrealistic for me, and a little too much cheating.
Shawn, on Luminar, check and see whether it will work with your graphics card, because I got one of the recent Topaz updates, and I have to get a new graphics card because it won't work with.
Okay, good point, Nancy. Thanks.
I guess that makes sense. I kind of splurged and bought the brand new Mac Mini Pro. It's like a 6-core processor because I was tired of Lightroom and Photoshop being extremely slow. So I used to edit on an iMac, the one that has like the monitor and everything combined. And then I just was frustrated with it. So instead of spending $7,000 on the iMac Pro, I bought the Mac Mini Pro, which is just that little box. It's got the exact same computer inside of it. And then you can buy an external monitor for much cheaper because Apple upcharges the crap out of it when they sell the iMacs. I find Apple to be some of the best for any kind of creative work, like video editing and photo editing. Engineering, Apple sucks. Windows and Linux is the way to go. But for creative work, I really like Macintosh. So I was trying to find an example of, we're talking about Luminar, and I wanted to find an example of an image that I went to town with those sun rays. Here we go. So yeah, this is, we had a nice sunset behind these clouds, but you can see with Luminar, you can place it behind, and did a ton of work to just make sure that it only's coming through where the holes in the clouds were. So that's from the highlands of Iceland. So yeah, Luminar can definitely be a lot of fun. Trying to find the original. Yeah, look at that. It's a huge difference. So that's the before and then the after on that one. It's a bit extreme, but part of the fun. It's all a creative process. It's very subjective.
Yeah. Do you ever lead workshops yourself, or are you mainly on the tutorial side? And
yeah, I don't really lead workshops. I guess since I don't have to do it financially speaking, I kind of get selfish and just do it for myself. And
that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of people do workshops. I mean, that's like their main source of income. So I have like a philosophy. I have a lot of friends like Nick Page and Ryan Dyer and Miles Morgan and Josh Snow and all these guys that make a living off this stuff. So why I'm not going to take their customers because they need them. I don't need to make money off of photography to live a good life. So I'm not going to steal people from them as far as workshops go. So yeah, tutorials are still great though. They definitely sell a lot, and but yeah, workshops I'll save that for those guys.
Yeah, no, I think this was a great starting tutorial, and hopefully some of our members will take advantage of your longer, more in-depth ones. Really appreciate your time tonight, Ben.
Yeah, of course, and I'm so happy to answer questions. Have you guys ever been to, it's a bit of a hike, but has anyone here been to Crestone, South Colony Lakes? It's an absolutely stunning place.
I have not.
So it's a high alpine lake, and if you've ever been to Italy, it reminds me of the Dolomites of Colorado. Like if I were to describe it as something. The mountains just absolutely insane there. And we were camping like right here, and it's like southeast. Not a lot of people know about it, but it's one of the most epic, probably my top 3 places to go in Colorado. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. The peaks there are huge.
That's great. How long of a hike in is that?
Oh, it's a good 9-mile hike.
And speaking of hiking, if anyone's in for a new camera bag, and I know Ben's been trying one, and I went in on the Kickstarter. There's another guy, Morgan Tahui. They have Zero Labs, and you can get one of Ben's photos.
Yes, this guy right here
on the bag for an additional $30.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. So yeah, Morgan's a super smart guy. We went to school together, and he started his own company, Near Zero. So they make these amazing ultralight camera bags, but you can take the camera insert out. The whole back opens up, just like a lot of camera bags, but this thing weighs like, I think it's like less than 0.2 pounds. And you can take the camera insert out, and it's better than any ultralight backpack I've ever used. So definitely cool to see him following his dreams there.
Yeah, so you can get a new camera bag and get a cool photo of Ben's put on it while you're at it.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be an ambassador for it, so it's pretty sweet. And then once he gets his website going, it'll be easier to get those, but cool.
If there are no questions, I think we wrap it up and let you get to enjoying your Friday evening, Ben. Again, appreciate your time. This is a wonderful presentation. Once we have the video edited, we'll send you a copy, and love
All right.
keeping in touch with you.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, and everyone else. Thanks a lot, and have a good night.
Yep. All right. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben, and everybody else.